A very happy New Year to you. It's a big day for us today, as my invitation letter mentioned to you. We start with this absolutely fascinating theme that Gilles Carbonnier would be discussing with us this morning on development models and humanitarian assistance. So bringing in development model, humanitarian partnerships in context of fragility, and of course, the very idea of peace. So this trinity we would be discussing, but the day is absolutely fantastic for some of us who are interested in evolving the very ideas around development model. And from that point of view, this morning is a great beginning for us. It's a breakfast seminar series of RIS under which we have done several lectures, but let me mention it to you that this is the first breakfast seminar which is at this level, and usually we are crammed in RIS conference room, which of course we are growing out of, and we have been thinking of shifting to Habitat or to a little larger room. So that I think is a good beginning in the new year. We are also happy later in the day around 11 o'clock with DFID, RIS would be launching or extending this exercise for bringing out the idea of our alternate narrative on development and how we can contribute through empirical evidences that are coming out of experiences of non-Anglo-Saxon region, and how that contribution can bring in what has been discussed in Europe and in many places as alternative take on Washington consensus. So that is going to be absolutely fascinating afternoon. And then, of course, later in the day, we go back to Africa. We would have the Deputy Foreign Minister of South Africa and a very rich panel to talk about India-Africa partnership, and then with Haiti, we close the day. So it's a very hectic day. As you know, the breakfast seminar is for around half an hour with the speaker, and then we give equal time for discussion. And today we are starting at 9, and we would close around 10 or so. We can also have an extended. We have some time in between till the 11 o'clock, so we can have some extended discussion. We are also very fortunate that today we are joined in by Dr. Yasmin Haque, the coordinator at this point for the UN, but she is a well-known face in India with those who are engaged with UNICEF. And her humanitarian concerns are very well known. She joined UNICEF in 2017 in Delhi, and she has served as Deputy Director of Emergency Program of UNICEF headquarters in New York, where she played a lead role in coordination of emergency programs and policies for effective UNICEF strategy. Dr. Haque served as the first UNICEF representative to South Sudan. Her previous positions include UNICEF representatives to Ghana from 7 to 10. So several missions she has served of UNICEF. And yesterday, when I mentioned about this, couple of my colleagues were inquiring which country she's from, and they were thinking that with this name, probably she's from West Asia or from North Africa. And then I asked her just now. So those who are sitting at the back who inquired, and they are waving from there, they inquired, and I think you would be glad to know that she's from Bangladesh. So that would be great. Now, Madame, may I request you to chair the proceedings and introduce our great speaker, Gilles Carbonnier, and set the ball rolling. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Professor. And it's always a pleasure to be at an event where we're covering such a wide scope of what people face. And Gilles is going to do us a big favor. He's going to bring the different pieces that Professor Chaturvedi talked about together and make sense of it for human development, for reaching the SDGs throughout the world. I asked Gilles how he would like to be introduced and what his passions are, and I think his passion really is research and teaching on international development. He has been elected the Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross in April 2018. But he comes with a wide experience of serving as an ICRC delegate in a number of countries, and they're looking at what is happening around him, developing an understanding and a curiosity around the dynamics of human development, even in conflict situations, and the economies that go along with conflict. He has been a professor of development economics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies since 2007. He has really taken a keen interest in the whole domain of political economy of conflict and humanitarian crises. As for his non-academic passion, he's in the place now where he is really getting to experience more of Indian classical music, which he loves very much. We'll turn to Gilles to hear from him his thinking and his experience on the whole issue of what development models can we be looking at that would leave no one behind and really address the issues that people face in humanitarian crises. So over to you, Gilles. Let's give him a good round of applause.
Madam Chair, dear Dr. Haque, Mr. Director General, dear Professor Chaturvedi, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, very good morning. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to address this very distinguished audience on the question of development models that might apply in fragile contexts, in the context of armed conflicts, armed violence. And I'm delighted to do so here at RIS, which is certainly one of the leading policy and development think tank in India. And I want to thank RIS for the invitation and the organization of this breakfast exchange. And I very much look forward to the conversation with you. And I'm also very glad to hear about the very exciting program that you had during the day. I was thinking it's a pity I cannot attend the whole day, because I'm sure that discussing also about critical issues related to South-South cooperation and to different development engagement and models will be extremely exciting. My topic will be a bit more modest. I will focus mainly on what it means to push a development agenda in the places where it is most difficult, which is mainly in the countries and regions where we have armed conflicts, armed violence, and fragile institutions. And I would contend that this is actually one of the most critical issues for achieving the SDGs, because time and again, research and reports show that, for instance, very recently, a report by the Overseas Development Institute was showing that as far as now, 82% of the SDGs, we are off track when we look at fragile and conflict-affected countries, meaning only 18% of the targets are on track, more or less, and this is certainly where it will be most challenging to achieve the SDGs. So with that, I'd like to discuss a bit the idea pushed forward 2 years ago and last year by the UN Secretary General to say we have to really have a triple nexus between humanitarian action, development, and peace, and bring this together in a consistent framework, and actually to do 3 good things at a time: humanitarian interventions and action, development, and peace. So what is the potential of bringing a triple nexus that actually works and leaves no one behind? But what are also the shortcomings of this model, and how we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, but more broadly, how economists and development professionals can really go about the shortcomings and trying to make it work for everyone. So, needless to say, when we speak of fragile and conflict-ridden contexts, we are speaking of about 2 billion people being affected. We have last year a record high of 69 million people forcibly displaced, about 25 million refugees, and just in 2017 alone, 16 additional forcibly displaced people. So what we see is that armed conflict can very quickly reverse former development gains. If we look at the Human Development Index of, let's take Yemen, in just 4 years, Yemen has slipped back 20 years in terms of HDI. If we look at Syria, it was just in 2 years that Syria lost 20 years of progresses in Human Development Index. So we see that this is there where we have prime territory for nexus between humanitarian intervention, humanitarian action, development and peace, in a global development landscape that is fast changing. And there is a paradox, ladies and gentlemen, between the bad news that we hear in terms of the impact of armed conflict and fragility, and the very good news that we see globally with great advances in reduction of extreme poverty, thanks to rapid and solid economic growth in major countries, including India and China, but also technological advances that allow to leapfrog some of the development stages that we were used to learn about in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. We have a new geography of poverty, where if you look back at the end of the Cold War, 80% of the poor were living in low-income countries, and 20 years later, 80% of the poor were living in middle-income, richer countries. So we have seen a relative decline in inequality between nations, but an increase in inequality within nations. And I think that in this framework, the SDGs can be seen as a new social contract among nations, but also between states and their peoples. We heard yesterday at the opening of the Raisina dialogue, the Prime Minister of Finland, and she was saying, well, in my country, which is often ranked, or Prime Minister of Norway, and she was saying, well, my country often ranks first on the HDI, but still, we are not done with the SDGs. We have many things to do to achieve the SDGs in Norway. I come from Switzerland. We have reports, yearly reports on advances, and we are off track on quite a number of targets, especially those targets regarding ecological sustainability, urbanization, and the question of also inequality within the country. So, with that, let me focus now on conflict-affected and fragile contexts. You might remember that Kofi Annan, when he was launching the Millennium Development Goals at the Millennium Declaration, he famously said there can be no development without security, and conversely, you can have no security without development. And I think the idea of a triple nexus that Antonio Guterres brought forward very much relates back to this notion, but it includes, beyond humanitarian action and development, the notion of peace as a central element. The assumption behind may be quite simple. The assumption is that you need development to spur peace and to achieve sustainable peace. And humanitarian action can help and sustain development in conflict and fragile environments. So this is the overall assumption that is behind the idea of the triple nexus. And we see in practice ever more linkages being done between different silos, between the silos of the investor community, the aid community, and within the aid community, the silos between humanitarian aid and development assistance, and I think this is most welcome. Now, there are many positive aspects to the triple nexus, because indeed, if you can do 3 good things in one stroke, why not? But there are a number of shortcomings, and I think that we have to focus a bit more on the shortcomings and how we can address those shortcomings. First, we have to disentangle the assumptions. Poverty is not the only root cause of conflict and violence, and we can see that it is not a linear process where development does not always guarantee peace. And indeed, we have seen armed conflict emerging ever more frequently in middle-income countries, Syria being one example. A recent research published by the UN and the World Bank under the title Pathways for Peace looked at how various countries were able to prevent conflict and violence and why others fell prey to conflict. And one of the major findings is that perceptions of exclusion, of injustice, perception of being excluded from political power, from access to natural resources, to land, to justice and security, is a major factor explaining conflict, and that fighting exclusion, having inclusive political and policy approaches, is of the essence. So what we see is that we don't have a linear transition or progress towards development and peace, that this transition can be reversed, and that we need to have more resilient systems, and resilient systems have to build on inclusive policies. Another shortcoming is that peace is not clearly defined. What is peace? As you know, in peace studies, there is a vast literature on negative and positive peace. But if we look at the discussion at international level, we see that peace is often equated with peace building or peacemaking, but very often also with stabilization and security. And peace is often equated with intervention at the global level, which are military and security interventions. And for a humanitarian organization like mine, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a purely independent, impartial, neutral humanitarian organization, being directly associated in a triple nexus that embodies, encapsulates military and security objectives and agendas is problematic. And I will come back to that a bit later on. So let me come to what is a triple nexus that works to leave no one behind in a development model that is appropriate for fragile and conflict-ridden contexts, based on some conceptual clarification. When I was a student back in the 80s, things were more simple. And I think being a professor back then might have been more simple as well. We had clear ideas, and humanitarianism was quite different from development. I was told, well, humanitarian action is short-term, and development is long-term. This is the first difference. Today, we see protracted conflict. I heard yesterday a podcast with President Trump, who was saying, I'm fed up of being involved in endless conflicts. What we see as the International Committee of the Red Cross is that the major conflict regions where we are operational, we have been operational there for an average of 36 years. So it's not only 1 or 2 decades, it's generations. And then the question for a humanitarian organization like the ICRC is how do we adapt our response to make societies, to make vital infrastructure, public services more resilient to recurrent waves of violence, and how do we engage development actors, peace actors in a meaningful manner, but always keeping our humanitarian space for neutral, independent, and impartial humanitarian action, whereby we are accepted by all the parties to the conflict on the ground. The second difference that was back then at a theoretical level quite clear is that development was really domestically driven. and development was requiring working with and through the states and local actors, national actors, who were in the driving seat, while humanitarian action was supposed to be more externally driven as a response to a crisis. And actually today this is not at all the case. More often than not, we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, we work to support local actors and national actors, to support local and regional, for instance, public utilities, the authorities, non-state actors, in being able to continue to provide essential support for markets to work, for essential services to be functional. So if these two differences are not valid anymore, then we have a third difference, which I would contend is still valid to a certain extent. Development is transformational. Development is about social change, social transformation, which involve political, cultural, and social economic aspects. And humanitarian action is much more conservative. The main objective is just to save lives, to alleviate suffering, and to protect human dignity. Maybe the most transformative aspect of humanitarian action is to ask and demand from states and from combatants and armed actors to abide by international humanitarian law, to abide by the rule of humanity that sets limits in the exercise of armed violence. And because of this difference between the rather transformational agenda of development and the more conservative agenda of humanitarian action is unconditional. It responds to needs in an impartial manner, regardless of political consideration, of ethnic consideration, regardless of any other consideration than the intensity and the urgency of needs, whereas development has often, as you know, been conditional. So if we look at this question of conditionality, it's quite important because actually when we refer back to the triple nexus of bringing together humanitarian action, development, and peace, we have learned the hard way that to start with, we should try to avoid doing harm. And the do no harm mantra came really very much to the fore, you might remember, in the mid-1990s, because people were shocked to see that aid conditionality and development intervention in Rwanda contribute to trigger the genocide in that country. And for the international community, this was a shock to say, okay, if we want to do good and intervene with development and aid interventions, we have to think that these interventions should not fuel conflict and even fuel and trigger possible genocide. From there, we can, of course, look at synergies between these three aspects of the nexus. So from our viewpoint, from a humanitarian viewpoint, a nexus that works is where civilians and civilian infrastructure is protected even in the midst of conflict, where civilian infrastructure is made more resilient to adverse shocks and can withstand shocks, and where vulnerable people are included. So let me disentangle and bundle these different aspects. People and infrastructure needs to be protected during conflicts. Actually, international humanitarian law requests a distinction between military objectives that can be legitimate objectives in the conflict, in the context of an armed conflict, and civilians infrastructure that must be protected. And decision on how war and conflict is conducted can have a huge impact on post-conflict development and peace consolidation. Because violation of international humanitarian law breeds grievances, breeds exclusion, and this makes post-conflict recovery much more difficult and complex. And this explains why we have so many failed peace processes where grievances re-emerge just a few months or years after peace agreements are signed. So achieving the SDGs in these difficult environments requires not only parties to armed conflicts to abide by IHL, but it requires the International Committee of States to really become serious about their commitment under the Geneva Convention to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. And we have engaged states which have an influence on parties to the conflict in Syria, in Yemen, in Ukraine, and in many other countries, so that they exert influence on the parties to the conflict with which they have contacts, whom they might directly or indirectly support in the context of partnered operations. Second, we have to focus on the inclusion of vulnerable people and to listen to local actors. Development, again, tends to be more state-centric. Humanitarian action is more people-centric, and actually, by providing humanitarian action, we often focus in places which are either neglected or simply out of the reach of the state. And this is very important to be able to provide support, life-saving support, but also long-term resilience interventions in these places which tend to be marginalized. I will give you a number of examples of what we try to do with this regard. And finally, we try to build shock-resistant critical infrastructure and essential services through innovative partnerships, which is absolutely of the essence to maintain life-saving services during shocks. So let me give you a few examples to become more concrete. I'd like to take a few examples from one domain of intervention, which is to ensure sanitation, provision of drinking water and wastewater treatment in urban areas, because conflicts and violence tend to be ever more urban and hit highly populated areas where humanitarian intervention and development intervention face completely different and somehow more complex challenges than in the former, more rural environment we were used to operate in. So in cities like Goma in the DRC or Marawi in the Philippines, we work with the authorities to develop new water master plans, water treatment as well as water provision master plans that take into account the huge demographic pressure related to the massive movements of populations. In the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, we have engaged the parties to the conflict so that they agree to preserve and not to attack the water pipes and the water pumping stations that flow across the front line. And this, to quite an extent, was extremely successful in order to be able to continue to ensure the provision of drinking water in the urban centers, which are in very sensitive areas. In Aleppo, in 2013, we saw that we were not able to maintain the existing water systems available to the population. So what we did is that we worked with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, but also with the local water board and local communities in Aleppo in order to restore broken wells that had been out of use for decades. And we have restored quite a number of water wells, and through an apps that was a geo-referenced apps that would indicate where the closest water well would be located for each and every household within Aleppo, we were able to indicate to the local population how to get access to drinking water even in the midst of the worst period of the conflict in Aleppo. So beyond these few examples, with just taking the example of water, we explore innovative partnership and financial models that brings together the investor community, the development community, and the humanitarian community. So this requires us, humanitarian actors, to be able to engage with development professionals, with academics, with businesses, to pool our expertise, skills, and resources to find better and new solutions for countless people whose need we cannot serve and service alone. An example is a new mechanism which is called the Famine Action Mechanism, the FAM, which has been launched by the World Bank together with the UN and the ICRC. And the idea is to intervene and prevent any food insecurity crisis before it reaches the stage of famine. So we pool the expertise of tech firms, including Amazon, Google, and many others. And these firms, what they do is that they help us strengthen the database that we have, as well as the capacity to treat and understand and make sense of data in order to have early warning signals and intervene much before the food insecurity translates into hunger and famine. We work with insurance and financial services industries that provide more predictable, sustainable funding in order to bring at scale these responses as soon as we have these forerunner signals that says that we have to intervene. And we are implementing these models now in South Sudan, in Somalia, in the Sahel. And this will be a model that will also be certainly spearheaded in Asia. So, just another example, I think, which is very, which speaks for itself, is that we have to now combine life-saving intervention with sustainability and development interventions. And in South Sudan, but also in the Sahel and in Nigeria, what we have done is that we have provided emergency food aid, including airdrops in South Sudan, for example, but at the same time, we provide drought-resistant seeds, tools to farmers, and we have worked with agro-pastoralists to make sure that we can extend veterinary services in zones of fragility, in zones of conflicts. And this seems not so exciting in terms of development models, but let me tell you that in South Sudan, we have vaccinated last year through the extension services, veterinary extension services, over 1 million cattle. And this is just the main and major assets for agro-pastoralists. And it makes a huge difference by allowing them to continue their economic activities and not falling fully aid dependent. So in terms of resilience, this is, I would argue, key. Last point is very important within a triple nexus that works to safeguard a space for independent, neutral, impartial humanitarian action. In places affected by conflict and violence, people may be left behind because of military front lines and political fault lines. And in these settings, it is important to have a space for neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian actors to be able to reach those left behind. So I would argue that if we look at the triple nexus, the comparative advantage of humanitarian actors is access without any armed escorts, and access is granted only if we have the trust of parties to the conflict. And the problem with contemporary conflict is that they are ever more fragmented. I got an example from my colleagues who were trying to reach Tripoli in Libya from the airport and from there to work throughout Libya. And recently, some of them told us, well, we had agreed before getting there with all the parties to the conflict that they would not attack us and that would grant security for aid interventions. But when we went to the ground, we met over 24 checkpoints with 24 different militias. And these militias, re-emerge, merge, or create new alliances every day. So if we get security guarantees on the eve of getting there, the next morning we have to renegotiate this on the ground. And if each of them is not convinced that we are purely neutral, independent, and humanitarian in what we want to do, we are excluded. So this is just to tell you that in some instances, this is really of the essence, to leave no one behind. So let me conclude by looking at this in the framework of South-South cooperation and the emergence or re-emergence of emerging economies as major actors globally, also in the aid market. We see huge opportunities to strengthen the nexus by working with India, with other emerging economies which have been experiencing fragility, which have been experiencing different development models, and are able to not only bring their resources, but bring their own visions, their own experiences, and their own agenda to the table when it comes to implementing the triple nexus that works. We have really moved towards trying to establish equal, fair partnerships, which are not, as they used to be, often are biased because of inequality in terms of resource availability. And we rebalance in our partnership not only resources, but also power and responsibility with local responders, with national responders in the different countries where we intervene, because we are convinced that this is the only way that we can go towards a triple nexus and a development model in fragile context that works for the excluded. If I just look at India to conclude, it's a country I really don't know well. As Yasmin kindly mentioned, I'm very fond of Indian classical music, so I enjoyed the music when I entered the room, and I hope I will have more time during the week to enjoy even a concert. But what I see in India is that, as we heard yesterday, with 1.3 billion people and what I heard also yesterday, up to 30% of the world's poor, definitely how India will be able to successfully achieve the SDGs will be of the essence globally in terms of looking at the SDGs as a success or a failure in just 10 or 11 years' time from now. And I think that we can really, within the framework of South-South and triangular cooperation, get much more partnership with Indian think tanks, Indian development experts. We are working also with the Indian military on international humanitarian law and other Indian actors in order to inspire our work and get globally better results, better interventions in support of people who need better responses to their plight. So we would like to see India assume a greater role, not just by taking on humanitarian responsibilities, but also by shaping and championing a strong humanitarian agenda within the SDGs and within a triple nexus that work. We have seen India getting much more involved, for instance, in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, with the chair of the governmental group of experts working on lethal autonomous weapons, and this is a very highly appreciated intervention and involvement of Indian diplomacy on a critical topic for the future of warfare. So with this, I'm sure that we will be able to exploit the potential of the triple nexus with southern partners, and India in particular, and I very much look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gilles, for really making that very strong pitch for considering the triple nexus of humanitarian development and peace and security for people-oriented sustainable results. You also helped deconstruct the three elements for us. You gave us some very good examples of how it has been applied with positive results for people. And you've also advocated very strongly for South-South and triangular cooperation in it and highlighted the role that India can play. So I think it's a time for us, really. I'm sure many colleagues in the room will have further questions for you. They might challenge some of the assumptions you've put forward. So we're really looking forward to hearing from everyone. I won't know names, so please do introduce yourselves as you make your question or your comment. And we have about half an hour, 20 minutes? Half an hour, okay. Please, sir.
The mic is just coming. You talked of conflict situations and development. I just want to take your attention to West Africa. Take Burkina Faso or Mali. Constant conflict and therefore very little development. And what takes place is a political party comes into power. The elite siphons off the benefits to itself. There's a military coup. The elite again takes siphons off the benefits to itself, and no development takes place. And development, as you've rightly argued, is an internal matter. how will you apply one of your development models to that kind of situation? And your triple nexus there has not worked, because the infrastructure there is okay in the cities. You go beyond the cities, nothing exists. And these countries got independent in the 60s. That development model, the triple nexus that you so well outlined, has not worked.
Thank you. Shall we take two more and then we, gentleman here?
Yeah, Ambassador Balakrishnan, let's talk a bit about Syria, which is really, we are approaching a time when Syria will be ripe for rebuilding and reconstruction, if peace comes. I've spent more than 3 years there, I know the country well. Somehow the humanitarian assistance community, the formal community, has not really leveraged the Syrian diaspora. Syrian diaspora is extremely strong and has a lot of resources. And it is one of the most effective agents for humanitarian assistance as well as development of Syria. So I was just wondering whether you have a formal approach to the diaspora. And this is a general thing, it can apply in other countries also. The other aspect is that both in development and humanitarian effort, engaging with local community groups, especially women, is one of the most effective ways of delivering development. So whether this has been taken into account.
Thank you. I'm going to take one for.
I don't want to monopolize this table. My name is Joy Bhattacharjee. This is to Professor Carbonnier, of course. In your presentation, you outlined your methodology and I may even say theology. But sometimes in this world, practical world that you live in, you come across forces and ideologies that are by definition, and their raison d'etre is opposition to all forms of human progress and thought since the French Revolution. Whatever ideas, whatever progress humanity has made, there are forces in the world which are resolutely opposed to that. Now, how do you reconcile your approach? How do you confront these ideologies and forces? Is it a Mexican standoff, or do you have a solution to it?
Thank you. 3 very interesting points coming up. So, Gilles, over to you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for your question, which are tricky and interesting question. So let me start with West Africa. Indeed, there is. I was discussing yesterday with a Ghanaian participant to Raisina, who is now in Korea, South Korea, and he was reminding me that independence struck. Well, the two countries became kind of independent and started development, autonomous development at the same time. But when you see the situation today, it's very different when you compare South Korea and Ghana. Now, when you go to Niger, Chad, Mali, and all these other countries, these are countries which have become, unfortunately, major operational contexts for the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we have taken over a number of activities from development organization and the state, which had been developed for decades in more peaceful contexts, but which either broke down very quickly or could be maintained. But what we really learned the hard way is the only way to maintain these, development gains that were previously done is to work directly with local communities and all the local actors, including local authorities. And this brings me a bit to the question of our distinguished colleagues who spoke of these forces which are not pro-development or which oppose any outside intervention. What we learned is that when we have to work with authorities, sometimes those who exert authority and power over the population and over the vital infrastructure and systems are not state actors. So what do you do? And this is where I think development actors, and especially UN development actors, would not feel at ease because it's not their mandate to start to work and engage non-state actors which de facto exert authority over population and territory, but de jure are not representative of a state. Under international humanitarian law, the first IHL applies to non-state actors and not only to state actors, which is a distinctive feature under international law of IHL. Second, the International Committee of the Red Cross has a mandate to protect and assist people even in the midst of war. And when we have to find solutions in terms of survival and maintaining development gains, which are absolutely essential for survival, we have to engage. So I don't say that it is easy because in each and every places, I was mentioning Tripoli in Libya, but of course in the Sahel and in Syria, engaging the actors in order to have access and just to be able to operate without being attacked is highly challenging. So we as a neutral, purely neutral humanitarian organization don't pass a formal ethical judgment on parties to a conflict. It's not our role. Our role is to determine who exerts actual authority over population and territory. And when I say actual, I mean de facto. And then to see how much we have to engage in order, A, to be able to operate in the region, and B, in order to lessen and alleviate the suffering the civilians are under. And this is where we find different modus operandi in order to work with them. This said, let me say and be very clear, when we work with designated terrorist organizations, we definitely condemn, and in the harshest term, all terrorist attacks. Because terrorist attacks by nature are a blatant violation of the fundamental principle of distinction that is the bedrock, I would argue, of the laws of war. So we do this, and we do this publicly, and don't take us wrong. But then once we try to engage in a dialogue on greater respect for the fundamental principles of humanitarian law, we also engage on the question of how we can keep water, drinking water and essential sanitation services, how we can keep medical services and health services operating, and we are supporting these health services and medical services. What is different today, I would say, I know, Yasmin, you have worked in South Sudan. I've been in South Sudan at a certain stage when a number of humanitarian organizations were celebrating 30 years of permanent operational presence in South Sudan. And they were saying, well, we have been here for 3 decades, but we cannot work with the hospital in Juba. It's useless. I say, come on, what have you been doing during 3 decades in South Sudan, providing medical assistance and telling me today it's useless? So this, by good last, is changing. And humanitarian actors and the ICRC for sure is investing in supporting local health services, for instance, both access and then the management of hospital, primary health care, in order to make them more resilient, even if for a number of months we have to leave the place because of security constraints. So this is absolutely of the essence. So I think I responded also partly to the question of you know, the forces that are resolutely opposing development intervention. Now in West Africa, what we are trying to do is to engage much more investors and the financial community and the financial development community. The president of the ICRC today is precisely in the Sahel, between Chad, Niger, Mali, and then he will go to Ivory Coast. But he's traveling there with what we call frontier investors, people who are ready to take risks that go beyond the usual risks of investing in places where investors can expect a reasonable return. And we are looking at donors who are ready to de-risk to a certain level these investments, which are critical in order to offer jobs and maintain markets functioning. These are things we had never done before, and this is where we are investing now because we are convinced that we can bring greater development gains and we can help investment in agriculture, agricultural rehabilitation, but also in economic activities. We can help maintain markets as functioning institutions, even in the Sahel today, if we engage in meaningful partnership with them. So this partnership, of course, raises question of how we are perceived as a neutral, impartial humanitarian organization. We have to be very careful to that. But I think this should not refrain us from engaging and trying all what we do in order to bring response, because it's a shame we cannot leave the hundreds of millions of Africans living in the Sahel region and in West Africa, just waiting for these crises to be resolved before development take hold. Finally, in Syria, yes, I think the idea to leverage diaspora is great. We have to be humble when we look at financial flows into conflict regions. Humanitarian aid is just a small fraction of remittances. The major lifeline for livelihood of people in so many conflict zones, Afghanistan included, is remittances. And if remittances from migrants and diaspora would be cut from one day to another, which happened in Somalia to some extent with countering the financing of terrorism measures that have been abruptly implemented and which created really huge problems in the case of Somalia back then in terms of livelihood. But this would be a complete game changer for the livelihood of people. So we are working with diaspora to see how we can better leverage remittances. We are also working with diaspora sometimes, which is a bit more tricky because diaspora are also involved politically. So sometimes they are interesting to connect with in terms of connections, I would say, but we have also to be careful and to be aware of their political positioning and how this might affect our license to operate in Syria, for instance, and other contexts. Finally, of course, we spoke about local communities and gender. We have more and more interventions with women groups. In West Africa, for instance, we have worked with a lot of women's groups in terms of microcredit for horticulture, and providing them not only microcredit, but also the seeds and tools and fertilizers necessary to grow vegetables and so forth. But I would say that the newest thing that we have been doing in Central African Republic is very interesting. We have worked with women farmers, and they said we cannot access our fields. Our reaction was to say, don't worry, we will discuss with the militias. And they told us, no, don't discuss with them. Just provide us a safe space so that we can engage directly the militias, and we will explain them why they need to leave us work. And this is what we have done, and I think this is the future.
Thank you very much. I think we take another round of questions. I think I had a gentleman here, and then, we have 3 hands coming up. Okay, please, let's start at this table where the mic is. Yeah.
I'll take advantage of the mic. Sachin, first of all, thank you very much for
Could
taking
you
advantage.
introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Rajat Nag, I'm with the National Council of Applied Economic Research. I was with the Asian Development Bank for a while. Sachin, thank you very much for taking advantage of Dr. Carbonnier's visit to get him to talk to us. Thank you very much, Dr. Carbonnier. Thanks for that excellent presentation. One point that I'd like to build on just for a moment. You made an excellent point about development being seen as long-term and humanitarian work being seen as short-term. And when I was at the ADB, this constant refrain kept coming up. And I think we failed many of our clients really by not working more closely with you, because there were issues that were more immediate. And we said, well, ICRC will take care of it. Once they've taken care of it, we'll go in when everything is safe. And that wasn't quite right. So I would strongly urge more, really, my colleagues in the development world to work more closely with you, because the gulf obviously shouldn't exist. Which leads me to the point that the work that the actors do and the triple nexus you talked about is really a continuum. And in the development world, there is a partitioning of these roles, which less of it will obviously be better. So I would strongly compliment ICRC for the efforts you make and strongly urge my colleagues in the development banks to work more immediately and more closely with you. And thanks very much for making the point about inequality. And that, I think, is the source of many of the issues and access to justice, gender issues that you have outlined. Thank you very much for that very excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have the gentleman next to him, and then we'll come to this table.
Thank you. I am Sanjeev Srivastava. I teach at University of Delhi. I'm also a researcher on foreign policy issues. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I have a great admiration for the noble work which you do all over conflict areas. And I think this is the greatest job one can do in lifetime. My question is about that I would like to know your experience that I know that you are not a mediating agency, you don't mediate in the conflicts, but when you go and do your work, I would like to know your experience, whether in what way or in any way it has helped in establishing a peace regime, a regime for cooperation among parties or a regime for stability and peace in that area where you are working. So I just like to know your experience on that.
And finally, the gentleman here.
So thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I am Milindo Chakraborty, from a visiting fellow from RIS, and I am also a professor in the School of Government and Public Policy in OP Jindal University. I was very, very fascinated by the idea of triple nexus that you talked of. But given the process of development model that we have been following today, I have a small question that whether the model that we are following are putting us into a vicious circle of this trap, that one is required to facilitate or to take care of the problems created by the other, whether we are getting into entrapped into a vicious circle. Thank you very much.
I think at this table there's one more, and then we'll close the questions.
Thank you for a very informative presentation. I'm Neelendra Kumar with the School of Transnational Law at Shenzhen. My question is with regard to the ICRC's initiative, particularly for the non-state victims. I'm talking about international shipping and piracy along the African coast. Thank you.
Thank you. So Gilles, another interesting batch of queries and comments to you.
Working with development banks, thank you very much for your comments. We have established, you know, we also at the ICRC, we should have engaged multilateral development banks much earlier, so we can, you know, have auto-flagellation of both sides, but we are engaging now. And let me just give you an example. As you know, the ICRC, we are also, we have a specific mandate and role in visiting detainees and prisoners. We are now also involved in the peace talks, be it, you know, the Astana process or Stockholm process, in terms of, as a neutral intermediary, being able to facilitate the release of prisoners. And we are working in many prisons and detention systems around the world, including in Central and South America. And there, what we face is what we face everywhere: overcrowding, lack of facilities, and it's a systemic issue. So we can do our reports and send our reports and recommendations to the state in a confidential manner, and the state says, yes, we know it's overcrowded, it's not appropriate, but this is as it is. It's not a political priority, budget lines are not there. And we have worked now with the Inter-American Development Banks, because they saw that it is one of the major factors that then fuels armed violence in Central America, and this is a major development program. So they said, yes, we will work with you and facilitate with grants and discussion with the state, better investment in infrastructure, in architecture, in the management of prisons and detention systems as a major way to move ahead. And this is a game changer compared to the experiences we have had over the past decades. Second, my own experience with peace processes and peace, you know, how peace takes hold or doesn't.
It's very varied from one country to another, and as you said, we are not a mediation organization. But what I think is critical is that development interventions have to, as much as humanitarian intervention, think of how to avoid negative side effects. And when I mentioned Rwanda as one example, it has been well documented that actually the conditionality, aid conditionality that had been imposed together with peace conditionality, and this was imposed simultaneously in 91, 92, 93, brought the regime in an untenable situation, and the regime, as you know, and certain elements of the regime were preparing for a mass-scale killing, which resulted in the genocide. But I would contend that international actors, we have been insensitive and blind to that. And the first thing, to me, in order to aid peace is to do just that, and make sure that we don't have negative side effects. The second is to work, but it's more political, to understand how the war economy functions, and to understand how we can help sustain a transition from a war economy to a peace economy. So this is more what I have invested as an academic and as a researcher, as a professor of development economics. This is not the work of the ICRC as such, but I think, you know, war economies create a lot of winners and many more losers. And of course, shifting from a war to a peace economy entails that winners are going to lose. And how do you deal with that is often neglected, and I think this is why often peace processes have face huge problems. The vicious cycle between the triple nexus, I think it's a broader question on what kind of development models do we project and promote, and what are the issues in the world, in the global world economic and political system order. And it is a broad conversation, as I would understand it. Let me mention just one research that I conducted before, which I think is, as a professor of development economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, which I think is, we are making progress, is simply trying to tackle illicit financial flows. It's something which is not, again, of the ICRC, but I have a research project going on now in several African and Asian countries looking at illicit financial flows related to commodity trade. And we are discussing it in Switzerland, which is a major commodity trading hub, to say, well, how can we provide more transparency in order for developing countries which export commodities, for them to be able to muster and mobilize domestic resources for financing the SDGs. So these are broad issues which I think are critical in a development model that works, but these are more developmental issues and not so much humanitarian issues per se. That said, again, commodity trade and natural resources are often a stake in a fragile environment and conflict-torn environment. And even if this is not the main concern of the ICRC, it's important to be aware of it and to see how inadvertently or advertently we fit into this global picture. And finally, piracy. Good question on the problem of piracy, for instance, along the Eastern African coast. We are not involved with military and security interventions trying to address piracy in, at sea. But we are working in Somalia and in other places on land. And the criminalization of which is related to pirate activities has dramatic implications for any chances of economic development in these regions, which are held by hostage to these criminal activities that represent huge stakes. And as much as we don't mingle with these activities, as much as we see the humanitarian consequences and try to deal with the consequences on the ground. So this is what I can say about piracy.
So I think we'll start wrapping up now. Thank you so much for your interest. And I'd like to go back a bit to the triple nexus, which is core to the whole Sustainable Development Goal plan and report. Also in 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit took place. And in that, it brought together nearly all, except for one or two of the humanitarian actors, but also importantly, the development actors. Because it's in this forum, it was very clearly given space and recognized that unless we address that continuum you talked about, the humanitarian development continuum, we will continue to see piecemeal responses. We'll continue to see humanitarian band-aids to situations. And importantly, drawing on the word that Gilles mentioned a number of times, resilience. How do we build resilience in a community, in a state? And for that, I think it goes back to the whole questioning of our development planning processes, our development paradigm. What do we base our solutions on? Are we doing the risk analysis, the threat analysis, based on what communities face? Is the risk analysis in Bihar the same as the risk analysis in Chhattisgarh or in Kerala? How are we taking that into consideration when we do our programming? Is it risk informed or not? And are we looking at being sensitive to the potential of conflict, to the existing conflict? And conflict is not necessarily always large scale. In South Sudan, one of the major issues was the conflict between communities, not the North-South. But the pastoralist life comes with a degree of conflict. The people who have the cows, the people who have the land that has the grass, and the people who don't have any of the two. So unless we understand the dynamics of the economy that drives, what drives the population, and we make provisions for it, we will not see the type of development that is needed. If we just look closer to our experience here in India last year, and if I compare it to what I saw the year before, we had major floods in Bihar in 2017, right? And then we had unprecedented floods in Kerala in 2018. If we look at the time that it took to recover, if we look at the scale in which people were reached, for some, it was very clear that Kerala, you went there 3 weeks later, it had been cleaned up. People had moved out of the camps. There was a system in place. And their programming, the years of development and strong systems in the state had helped a quicker recovery. Whereas in Bihar, it took us much longer even to reach the people who were most affected. So unless we, in our development in Bihar, we really look at the threats that people face, and these are natural disasters. These are elements that, again, climate change does play a role in it, but still, there is a predictability around it. How are we informing our annual plans by our risk analysis is important. We talk about women and children, and what are the threats they face when there is a disaster, when a humanitarian crisis does occur? Do we have the systems in place that will help mitigate the threats that they face? It comes back to the whole issue of what's the best investment in a development world, and I'll bring it back to education also. That the investment in education, the investment in communities, investment in community structures and systems is really what helps build resilience within the communities, within the state. And here in India now we have the focus on aspirational districts based upon the fact that these are the districts where much more investment is needed. Because we see that the indicators of human development are not matching the average in the country. So it's that type of analysis that is really needed to say, where do we put our energies, where do we put our resources, and then see the model working. But unless we address all three elements of it, or keep our minds open to the analysis that addresses all three elements, we will again be going into a siloed approach. So I hope from the discussion today, many colleagues here in your own spheres, in your work areas, in the way you contribute to development or humanitarian or peace and security nexus, that you'll embrace the other two and really advocate for a more comprehensive way of looking to development models in India and in any South-South cooperation that we take forward. So, Professor Chaturvedi, thank you very much for bringing us to this forum. Thank you, participants, for being here and bringing up some challenging questions to Gilles. And I think all of us benefit from this intellectual stimulation of how we need to push ourselves a bit more to not be blindsided to one element within the nexus. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Haque, for excellent summary, and thanks, Gilles, for very stimulating address. And I think it's a great beginning for us. You very rightly pointed out importance of localization and role of local actors. And RIS has been articulating this position for quite some time, particularly in context of SDGs, and as Dr. Yasmin gave example of Bihar and Kerala, I think it is very much an outcome of what role local agencies play and what role local administration takes up. So this is something we have been articulating through RIS papers and our writings on importance of localization of SDGs. Until that happens, it's not going to move forward. And as Prime Minister has yesterday, you heard him, and he has been emphasizing in terms of how sustainable development goals are not alien to us, how they become part of the development strategy that countries are adopting. And in case of India, as the VNR from India showed, is absolutely clear. Your lecture also reminded me of a dilemma we had in 2015 when RIS was bringing out our flagship report, South Asia Development Cooperation Report. And the conflict with Pakistan was on. And then my colleague who was editing the report, Ram Upendra Das, then we thought peace creating prosperity or prosperity bringing peace. So with Pakistan, how we move forward. And then the conflict was also in terms of how we address the same issue in context of Chair, you mentioned about Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, where we have conflicts, ongoing conflicts with Naxalites. So how we do issues related to skill upgradation in conflict-affected areas. And you very rightly emphasized role of science and technology. And incidentally, we have a big group today in the room who are part of our science diplomacy program. You emphasized two very important examples you gave. One of how drought-affected seed varieties are going to be useful in conflict-affected areas. And this is very important. In India, we have Water Technology Center, which has developed some drought-resistant varieties, and they are absolutely important. And some of them actually are naturally occurring, which they sort of could collect from areas growing wheat in the country. So that is one important example. You also mentioned about inclusion of financial services. And there again, as little later, we would be talking about India's emphasis on financial inclusion, avoiding huge exclusions that our banking architecture has created. So what role technology can play in facilitating financial inclusion through public bank accounts? In Bangladesh, we see how the small credits have done, microcredits have done, but what can be done through these financial services that you referred to, skills and seeds that you referred to. And of course, that's where the niche for sharing these experiences and localizing them through South-South cooperation comes in. And that, I think, you very rightly emphasized on triple nexus. In my view, towards the end of probably, I think it was the last question when you alluded to it, again, on something on which RIS has worked in terms of illicit financial flows. And I'm very glad that you come from Switzerland and you speak about this, because Switzerland is the destination. So until and unless countries and citizens from these countries come up and raise voice about the financial gains for these countries, but losses for many. And you would see that the conflict-affected areas are also the ones from where huge financial outflows are there. In India, we have taken strong measures in last couple of years to address transfer pricing as major issue. But it also requires, and India probably is one of the only developing countries which is financing what came out of Financing for Development Addis Ababa Action Agenda for SDGs, where India agreed to support a United Nations group on tax harmonization. OECD was resistant to that, but developing countries prevailed, and in the UN, we now already have that. So finance plays an absolutely important role, and you as a development economist probably would play far greater and effective role through the position that you have in terms of how international agencies like ICRC can influence this development narrative at a global level. But friends, it was absolutely fascinating. I thank Gilles Carbonnier for his excellent, stimulating address, and of course to Dr. Yasmin for her excellent chairing and summary. We would have a coffee break and we would be back here by 11. Thank you.
Yeah, let's have a big
I